Hi everybody, I'm Dia Nagraj. I'm the Associate Curator of Exhibitions, and I'm here today with Dr. Todd Reiser, who will be talking about collecting. So as you may know, he is the collector who very generously loaned us part of his collection for the Art Nouveau Innovation exhibit, and he's been generous enough to also bring some of his pieces here so we can talk about how to become a collector and how to understand some of the porcelain pieces you may already have in your home. So to start with, kind of how do you evaluate a piece? So if you're in an antique store or looking online, what do you look for?
Oh, first I look for scarcity.
Okay.
Some pieces are quite common, like the Christmas plates nowadays. So here we have a 1969 Royal Copenhagen Christmas plate. They made countless Christmas plates over the years, and unfortunately the value of these plates has declined quite dramatically, in part due to the internet as well and sites such as eBay. But there are some of the earlier plates that are still valuable. They've lost some of their worth, but the first Royal Copenhagen Christmas plate from 1908, for example, that's still highly desirable, as are the first 5 years of the Christmas plates that were produced by Bing & Grøndahl.
And how do you evaluate a piece's condition? What do you look for when you're at that?
In terms of the condition, first I look to try and see if the piece is perfect, if there are any types of repairs that were done. And then obviously any cracks, hairlines, chips. Mm-hmm. Also, I assess the quality of the porcelain itself. If there are small black specks in the porcelain, this is a negative. If there are other blemishes in the glaze, this can also be a negative. But this may not deter me from purchasing the piece. Again, it's one needs to weigh the rarity or scarcity of the piece versus the condition. I've purchased many pieces that required small repairs, and again, if you purchase these pieces at a reasonable price, then the cost is really not a major issue.
Okay. And one thing I noticed when I was installing the exhibition is that a lot of the pieces have markings on the back. So can you tell us more about what those markings mean and how we can use those to evaluate a piece?
Yes. Take this piece here, for example. So this is by Bing & Grøndahl. There's a book that you can see all of the markings. These can be dated. The earliest pieces from Bing & Grøndahl simply have B&G in blue on the back, and we have some of those pieces in the exhibition here. Thereafter, the marking went to the B&G in blue plus the phrase Danish China Works. And the pieces that are marked Danish China Works were produced from about 1896 to 1902. And the Danish China Work mark comes in different forms. After that, starting in 1902, the phrase made in Denmark in one line in green. So that these pieces were produced up until 1915 with that mark. After that, the mark changed. Then they went to another mark, B&G, made in Denmark. And the later mark runs until 1948. So the pieces that I'm most interested in from a collector's standpoint, from my perspective, would be prior to 1915 with the earlier mark. And I've always tried to acquire pieces at the time that they were first introduced. So a lot of the figurines, for example, from Bing & Grøndahl were introduced around the turn of the century. So ideally, one would want to get a figurine from that same time period, as opposed to a later version. Some of these figurines were made for close to 80, 90 years. So they were in production for a very long time. But the later pieces are less desirable from a collector's standpoint.
And speaking of earlier versus later, we have two examples of the blue fluted dinnerware set. So this is from kind of the museum's collection of, touchable objects and handleable objects, and then you brought with you a earlier version.
Yes.
So how would people tell the difference between something that's an 18th century original and something that was made in the 20th century?
Well, the 18th century pieces tend to have a grayish look to them. The color of the porcelain is different, and they also have a greenish tinge to the glaze. So here we see an example of a very early blue fluted handleless teacup. This was produced about 1790 to 1800. And the mark on the bottom has the three wavy lines. And the early pieces have various other markings in blue that indicate the artist. And some of these can now be identified by name. Turning to the later piece here, we can see that the color of the porcelain is much whiter.
Mm-hmm.
So again, advances were made. And if I look at the mark at the bottom here, okay, here we have the marking. We have the three wavy blue lines, which again is found on all pieces of Royal Copenhagen. The green stamp, Royal Copenhagen, Denmark, and the blue number 60. This mark was used between 1923 and 1934 with the blue number.
Oh.
So we can date the piece in that era. Then we have a fractional number here. 1 is the pattern number for the blue fluted, and 519 is the number for the form of the coffee pot. There were many different shapes that were done for the blue fluted.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really interesting to know, because I personally didn't realize this piece was as old as it is. And you mentioned artist marks. What do those look like?
Okay, here I brought some examples. Here's another very early piece of Royal Copenhagen, another handless teacup, and this is among their earliest pieces, done approximately 1778 to 1780. And again, we see the blue wavy lines. They tend to be further apart and fairly wavy. And there's also 3 red-colored dots on the side, and that's another indication of being an early piece. That's the artist that painted this particular piece.
Oh.
But Royal Copenhagen primarily focused on production of the blue and white and the dinnerware for the general population.
Okay.
So there were far fewer pieces such as this produced in different colors. Then I have some other examples here. Here's a small vase, and here again we see the 3 wavy blue lines. And in this case, the mark in green is a crown in Denmark. So this indicates that this particular vase was produced between 1894 and 1897. And then we have the green number 78, and the blue number 14 designates the artist, and some of these are known by name as well. The current Kunst or market art began in 1893 with 16 women painters. So again, this is a very early example of some of the first work that was produced for the general public that was much more affordable than the unique artist-signed pieces that are in the present exhibition.
Can you give us a twirl to see all sides of that?
Sure. And it's a very nice Art Nouveau piece. They use these decorations on other items as well.
Okay.
I also have a small teacup and saucer in my collection with the same pattern.
Perfect, thank you.
Then moving on, Here's another example of a small vase. Again, something like this, or the vase I have here. These are pieces that one could conceivably find on occasion. And price-wise, they are still quite affordable. You can find these on sites such as eBay once in a while as well. So something like this would probably run perhaps $100
Okay.
in that range.
So it's a good introduction to the world of collecting. To start
Yes.
there and then move into the more
Right.
expensive, unique
Mhm.
pieces.
Yep, exactly. So this piece is slightly later. So we have the round Royal Copenhagen stamp.
Mhm.
Again, the three wavy blue lines, the fractional number 336 over 162, and then blue painter number 53. And again, the number designates the pattern and then the shape. So the shape is 162, the pattern is 336, and you can determine approximately when the shape and the patterns were introduced as well.
And that's a particularly interesting pattern as well.
Yes, yep. And it's nice that it's 4-footed, so something like this would be a little more unusual. Then we talked about the condition earlier. So here's another nice footed piece with a crow, but it does have about a 1-inch hairline crack here. But again, I mean that wasn't terribly troublesome for me. I think I paid something like $20 for this on eBay, so I wasn't about to quarrel. So again, it's a judgment call based on condition, scarcity, price. But one wouldn't want to pay, say, $150 for something like this either,
Right.
based on the condition.
And when you do have pieces that have small cracks or other kind of issues with the condition, where do you go to get them repaired if repairs are needed?
Yes, I've been using a porcelain restorer that's south of Chicago, Broken Art in Moments, Illinois, and they've done a very good job for me over the years.
So there are specialists who just focus
Yes.
on
Yes.
restoring porcelain.
Then brought another piece here. This one is far scarcer. Again, a nice Art Nouveau piece, but when we look at the bottom here, we don't see the green markings, but what do we see? Again, we see the 3 wavy blue lines. This is how the unique pieces are marked, and they used a dating code for this. The number 4333, this is the unique number for this piece. So there was only one like this that was ever done. The artist is Olaf Jensen, initials OJ. And then the code that they developed is based on letters and numbers. So this is I. So that this designates that the piece was made in 1893. And the number 10, which is a month, so that would be October.
Oh.
And
Fitting for October.
And if we look very closely with this, on this piece, you can feel with your finger that there's a scratch mark through the 3 wavy lines. So this piece would be designated as second quality. But again, looking at this piece, in my eyes, it's essentially flawless. You see one tiny black speck here. So oftentimes these pieces that are marked second are still very highly desirable. But if they have major flaws, then the factory also would mark the piece down as a second.
Okay. And would those have still been offered for sale to the public?
Oh yes, yes. And that there are records as to who purchased these pieces as well from the factory, where they were sold, and for what price in a lot of cases.
So if you wanted to, if you have a unique piece, you are often able to trace the full history of it.
I do have the records from the factory, so I'm fortunate in that that I can trace the pieces based on the blue number.
Wow.
So if I see a piece on eBay, I can track it based on the blue number and see if it was sold at the Chicago World's Fair, for example.
And so we've talked a lot about porcelain, but as we discussed, Royal Copenhagen and Bing and Grøndahl expanded past just porcelain into stoneware and faience.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the difference between the three and how how they look different and what to look for in stoneware and faience versus porcelain.
Sure. Well, the difference between porcelain, stoneware, faience, it's partly based on the composition of the materials.
Okay.
So in porcelain, you use quartz, feldspar, and kaolin.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the three key ingredients. And in stoneware and faience, it's quartz, feldspar, and either a white clay for faience or a grayish clay for stoneware. And these materials are fired in the kiln at different temperatures under different conditions. The porcelain is fired at the highest temperature.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why a lot of the colors don't hold up. So again, it was a major technical advance with the underglaze painting to
Mm-hmm.
develop colors that would withstand the high firing temperatures. In the case of faience, it's fired at a much lower temperature. So here the artists have a wide range of colors that they could use. They could use most any color that they'd like, and it will withstand the firing. And stoneware pieces are glazed rather than painted. And here we have an example done by Nils Thorsen. This is contemporary from the dates from about 1960. And again, there's a brownish glaze here that covers the surface and with a leaf pattern.
Wow. And are those as scarce as some like the Art Nouveau porcelain, for example, or how do you judge the scarcity of the stoneware versus the porcelain?
Some of the stoneware is just as scarce and just as desirable or more so in some respects as opposed to the Art Nouveau porcelain.
Okay.
Stoneware has become very popular. Some of the best artists for Royal Copenhagen would include Knud Kind, Jai Nielsen, and also Axel Salto, who's particularly popular at present. So some of his pieces go for many thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm. And Bing and Grøndahl also introduced stoneware.
Yes, Bing and Grøndahl started about the same time as Royal Copenhagen in terms of stoneware.
Mm-hmm.
Stoneware at Royal Copenhagen was started basically by Patrick Nordstrom,
Mm-hmm.
who came to the factory from Sweden. So he developed a lot of different glazes, quite spectacular based on some of the French ceramists from the 1890s. Then he had a thrower with him, that was Carl Hollier.
Mm-hmm.
So stoneware clay is thrown rather than molded, so you produce stoneware on a potter's wheel, so to speak. So it's turned, as opposed to the porcelain, which is fairly fluid, so that can be poured into molds.
There are obviously many major companies that produce porcelain. So how, you mentioned the markings as one key way. What do those companies also have markings that you'd be able to identify, say what's Meissen pottery and porcelain from Royal Copenhagen and Bing and Grøndahl?
Yes, each manufacturer has their own markings.
Okay.
And the underglaze technique was adopted by many other factories. Those in Scandinavia
Mm-hmm.
include Rörstrand. So there's a green Rörstrand mark on some of those pieces. And again, they have the underglaze painting. They have a lot of model decoration. Tends more towards the work from Bing and Grøndahl as opposed to Royal Copenhagen. Then
Mhm.
Porsgrunn in Norway, they use a anchor mark on the bottom. And those pieces more closely resemble those that were produced by Royal Copenhagen. That was begun in 1905, and one of the current Kunster Marcus artists actually moved from Royal Copenhagen to Porsgrunn to start the underglaze technique there.
So that seems to be a kind of a theme of some of the major artists at Bing and Grøndahl and Royal Copenhagen sharing their knowledge with other factories.
Yes, that's true. The same thing happened with Bing and Grøndahl. Bing and Grøndahl hired Frans Holland from Royal Copenhagen to
Mhm.
perfect the underglaze painting technique at Bing and Grøndahl.
Okay.
Because prior to that point in time, the painting was fairly primitive. And the other area is Danish faience,
Mhm.
and that's been in production for many years. It actually preceded the start of Royal Copenhagen. So some of the earliest faience goes back to the early to mid 1700s.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting connection and a very important connection between the faience and Royal Copenhagen. The factory Aluminia, that's the faience factory that was started in Copenhagen in 1863.
Mm-hmm.
And Philip Skow was the owner of that factory starting in 1868. In 1882, Philip Skow purchased Royal Copenhagen,
Mm-hmm.
and the porcelain production moved from their old factory at 50 Kopenhagersgade to the new facility at Frederiksberg. All new kilns were produced.
Mm-hmm.
The faience that was originally produced by Aluminia was very primitive, and the company relied a lot on the designs coming from England. So we see like the blue willow pattern reproduced by Aluminia
Mm-hmm.
during the latter portion of the 1800s. And in 1902, this is the point in time where Aluminia had its renaissance in terms of Art Nouveau, just like Royal Copenhagen porcelain did back in 1885. So they went to some brightly colored pieces, a lot with floral decorations, and again, exemplified the Art Nouveau motifs. The markings on the bottom are oftentimes more difficult to discern, particularly on the early pieces. They may be stamped Aluminia. Here the mark is impressed into the clay, so it's more difficult to see oftentimes. But their standard mark has been called the beehive mark. So it's basically an upside down U with 3 wavy lines through it. The mark is typically in green, and this was used for long periods of time.
And are they still producing faience products today?
Faience is no longer being produced, and the porcelain is actually now being produced in Thailand, so no longer in Denmark.
So I suppose a good way to tell kind of what's very, very recent is to look for the made in Denmark versus not. It wouldn't. I suppose it can't have that label anymore.
Yes, that is correct. So the pieces that are produced in Thailand are stamped hand painted since 1775, and you are correct. They can no longer say made in Denmark, obviously.
So that's a pretty good way to tell what's very, very recent from what's a little bit
right
older.
And about the only pieces that they're making today are the blue fluted pattern, and there's also what they call the mega blue fluted pattern, which is an enlarged version of the blue fluted. So they're basically confined to dinnerware. So none of the underglazed decorated figurines are produced anymore, the vases, anything like you've seen in the exhibition. So that's all history at this point.
So for anybody who's looking to start out collecting, are there any places you'd recommend they go, or any sites that you'd recommend?
Over the years, I've purchased a lot of pieces on eBay, and that's probably the easiest. There are some online auction sites that one can access as well. Some of these include the European auctions, but some of the issues there, of course, is getting your purchase back to the U.S. Some of these auction houses, they don't do their own packing, so then you have to contact another independent shipper to go to the auction house, pick up the item, pack it, and then send it, so that this can add quite dramatically to the cost sometimes. So you have to weigh your real interest and value in that piece versus the hassle of trying to physically get the item here.
You have to make sure you really, really want that piece.
Yes, right.
And then you said every once in a while you find one in antique stores and like local in-person auctions as well?
Yes, that happens, but nowadays quite rarely. But I always enjoy running into something myself in a little antique shop, as opposed to finding things online. And in the old days, of course, that's how it was done. And, years ago, when I was on vacation in Maine, I walked into a small shop. It was mostly jewelry, but they had a sign regarding antiques as well. And I looked in the case, and there was a triangular dish with 3 model lizards on it, Royal Copenhagen from about 1905, tremendous piece. It was $85, and pulled out my wallet. The purchase is very simple. And I was delighted. It made my vacation.
Nothing like some surprise porcelain to go with your vacation.
Sure. But the thrill is in the hunt, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Is there any piece in your collection that is especially dear to you because of the process you had to go through to get it?
Well, that one dish with the 3 lizards would be one of them. And then many years ago, my father and I were attending a large antique show, and we split up so we could cover the antique show quicker.
Mm-hmm.
And we agreed to meet up again about an hour and a half later. So as I was making my rounds, I spotted a nice Royal Copenhagen vase with chickens and cherry blossoms. I believe that's in the exhibition here as well. So that I purchased, and my father stopped at the same dealer, asked the dealer if he had anything, but he said, unfortunately, he had a nice vase with chickens on it that a young man just purchased. So at that point, I think he breathed a sigh of relief, and when we met up, I told him, look what I found.
So thank you so much for tuning in to How to Be a Collector 101, and thank you to Dr. Todd Reiser for being so generous with his time and his research and his collection as well. Our Art Nouveau Innovation show will be on display here until January 3rd. And if you are unable to make it to Elkhorn, it will also be going on the road, and it will be stopping in Ames, Flint, and Dubuque. Thank you very much.